The chandelier trembled as if it too had heard the man's fury. A single goblet, crystal, oversized, a wedding gift more than a drinking glass, slid from a valet's hand and shattered in a rain of glittering shards against the marble floor. The sound opened like a wound through the lobby, a high, brittle scream that silenced conversations and washed the polished surfaces in sudden, brittle attention. Karim Alfahad stood at the center of the storm. His presence had always been the kind that rearranged a room before he moved. Sculpted features, a suit cut so clean it seemed to erase seams, and eyes that had learned to calculate value the way some people count the steps to a doorway. Now, those eyes were thunderous. He pointed at a man in a navy blazer. The hotel owner wasn't here, but the manager had inevitably stepped up to fill the role. And his words came rapid, clipped, the sort of impossible corporate Arabic that left no space for misunderstanding. "How could you allow this? How could you let something like this happen in my name?" he demanded. The assistants around him clotted into a nervous ring, the concierge smoothing his tie they never knew how to wear with dignity, a receptionist clutching a tablet like a shield, and Mr. Garcia, the hotel manager, who had seen tempers flare before, but never with the kind of purse strings behind them. Mr. Garcia's voice was small, professional. "Mr. Alfahad, sir, It's not about apologies," Karim snapped. "It's about respect. And when places like this fail to respect—" He swept a hand over the lobby as if scolding the marble itself. A hush followed, the kind that smells faintly of perfume and disinfectant. The staff glanced at one another. The hotel's code of conduct was a paper blessing in most crises. It did not, however, provide a human bridge for the rawness now in the room. Lila Mendez was in the eye of that storm, and no one knew it yet. She had been moving through the lobby on autopilot for hours, 10 rooms cleaned already, a cart with fresh linens that had become part of her silhouette. Housekeeping taught invisibility as a skill. Be quick, be unobtrusive, make the room feel whole again, and leave without being acknowledged. It was a craft, not a resignation. Lila had learned to carry dignity in the soft way she tucked a pillow corner, in the meticulous folding of turn-down blankets, in the way she carried herself even when the work required bending and lifting and constant apology. Heard first because he needed a target, thought Lila. Seen first because he was loud. She had that poor, inevitable clarity that comes from being trained to read intent in a guest's gait. The man was not only angry, he was worried his wrath might translate into something more costly than an insult. The staff feared reputational damage. They feared expensive lawsuits more than they feared the trembling in their own hands. They circled like skittish courtyard birds. "Excuse me," Lila said, softly enough that the line of managers and assistants didn't immediately hear. She had not meant to speak. She rarely did in these thunderstorms. But the tone in Karim's voice carried something else, not just anger, but a fraying of a language he assumed was one-sided. There are languages, she had learned as a child raised between embassies and exile dinners, that go beyond grammar, where tone, a phrase, the particular suffix of formality, could convert a blitz into a negotiation. Lila stepped closer. People moved instinctively aside. The housekeeper is an invisible cartographer of private spaces, but in public places she was the last to be noticed. Her uniform was a modest navy dress, starched at the collar. Her hair was pinned in a practical twist. And behind the practicality was a steady, practiced calm. "Ya Sidi," she said. "Sir." She kept her voice even. She kept her hands open, palms relaxed, so no one would mistake safety for defiance. "Please, one moment. Let me speak." Karim's head snapped to her. Silence, fragile and incredulous, spread. The hush was not just for the interruption, but for the register she chose. Arabic, but not the clipped corporate form Karim used. It was the warm, measured Arabic of someone who had been raised on other people's tongues and had made them her own. She said another sentence, soft and precise. "Ahlan ya akhi, calm down. Let's talk. You are worried about respect. Give me the chance to show you what happened. Ahlan ya akhi. Welcome, my brother. Familiar, not servile. The phrase landed like a hand on a shoulder. For a heartbeat, the lobby held its breath. Staff who had been trained to look away now looked at her with new eyes. Patricia, who usually leaned on the concierge desk dividing gossip like sugar packets, had the expression of someone catching a surprising plot in a telenovela. Mr. Garcia's mouth formed an apology that wasn't finished. Karim's shoulders loosened a fraction. Curiosity had a habit of seeping in where fury had been allowed to stand alone. He answered, first in clipped Arabic, then a softer line. "You speak Arabic?" Lila nodded. "Yes, I grew up among diplomats. I lived in Muscat for a while. My mother, she taught me the words of calm." She switched fluidly into a few words of Portuguese, smiling at the thought of a phrase she knew would feel like a reunion to certain ears. "Bom dia." "Good morning," she translated for the room. Silence cracked into a different rhythm. Surprise, then adjustment. The billionaire's rigid composure slightly unraveled into something curious and, if anyone were paying close attention, vulnerable. Here was the reversal the title would later insist upon. The angry Arab millionaire's rage, softened not by money or power, but by a housekeeper's fluent Arabic revelation. The lobby exhaled. What should have been a shriek of scandal became conversation. Karim blinked, shifting the energy in the room. He stepped back from the manager, and for the first time in the confrontation, his posture was not of accusation, but of possibility. "I didn't expect this," he said, then switched to English, as if to anchor the conversation in a place he could measure. "Who are you?" "Name's Lila," she replied, choosing the easiest form of her identity for the place. "Lila Mendez." There was a small, disarming steadiness in the way she said it. Her name was not furniture, it was not a trademark, it was her. Karim's anger didn't evaporate, it simply reframed into something else, a narrow, focused interest. "Lila Mendez," he repeated. The letters felt unusual coming from someone used to signing off on investments and verticals. "You're a housekeeper." "Yes," she said, "at this hotel." "And you speak fluent Arabic?" "Yes," she said again, "fluent." The word did not require explanation. A thin smile crossed Karim's face, one of those smiles that read like a contract amendment. Interested. Around them, the staff began to whisper, apologies couched into head bows. Conversations restarted as the crisis recalibrated into curiosity. The lobby returned to its rituals, but this time it did so with a new map. An invisible line between guest and staff had been redrawn by the knowledge of a language. Mr. Garcia, suddenly aware of the optics, cleared his throat. "Mr. Alfahad," he began, too grateful for the event to sound original. "We appreciate your patience. We'll—" "Enough," Karim said, "but not sharp. No, don't apologize." He turned toward Lila as if making an executive decision about a project mid-meeting. "Would you join me for dinner, tonight? There are things I would like to know." The sentence hung in the air with two possible weights, an invitation and an implied transgression. In that moment, everyone in the lobby looked at Lila the way oceanographers look at a sudden gulf in old familiar charts. An ordinary worker was now offered passage into a world usually shelved behind velvet ropes and signed confidentiality agreements. Lila felt the lobby press into her back. It was a pressure she had carried her whole life, the pressure to be small enough not to disturb. Now the pressure suggested an opportunity. She was not naive, the world was not a fairy tale, and she had rules. "I don't take invitations to cross those ropes without a reason," she said. Her voice was steady, she was practiced in the economy of speech. A single line could be a contract. "If this is about an apology, sit with the manager. If it's about the hotel, speak with management. If it's about work, we can arrange a meeting. But if it's a personal invitation—" "It is not personal," Karim said immediately. "It is business." He said the word business deliberately, as if sealing it with his signature. "My people and I are in Brazil for potential investments. I will be here only a short time. There will be meetings, negotiations. I believe a bridge could be useful." "Your language, your calm, could be useful." Lila held his gaze. useful. She knew that word well. It had been thrown at her all her life, sometimes like a compliment, sometimes like a dismissal. "What are you offering?" she asked. "A temporary engagement," Karim said, "for 2 weeks. Consultancy. We pay market rate. We formalize it. Contract, confidentiality, everything legal. You continue your studies. Your job here remains secure." "No," he softened, probably aware of the way power could swallow agreement. "No strings beyond that, unless you wish otherwise." The lobby had narrowed into a courtroom. Every person around them judged the terms with the currency of gossip. Patricia's eyebrows climbed in interest. Mr. Garcia's relief was almost visible. Karim's assistant moved to the side, already composing emails that would sanitize human unpredictability into a schedule and a bullet list. Lila thought of her mother. Helena had taught her that every door had a frame, and crossing a door without looking at the frame invited a fall. She thought of her master's books piled at home, sociology and international relations stacked with care, open to the crusted pages where she had marked lines about soft power and cultural translation. She thought of the scholarship application she still hadn't finished. The money would help, certainly. The exposure, perhaps. But more than anything, she felt a pull she recognized. The chance to let the world see what she could do beyond the cart. Her voice was level. "If it's professional, we do it right. Contract, lawyer, clarity on scope. I don't do favors. I don't negotiate under pressure. 2 weeks, paid, my hours protected. No expectation of anything personal. If you cross that line, the agreement ends." Karim nodded, taking the terms as if they were new data to be computed. There was a moment where the power dynamic returned to its ledger-like balance. His wealth and leverage on one side, her boundaries and conditions on the other. But what surprised him, and the room, was how firm she sounded. Not defensive, not apologetic, firm. "Agreed," he said. 2 weeks, my lawyer will draft it. We fly tomorrow morning." He said the last part as if it were a schedule, and perhaps, in his world, schedules were a kind of promise. The staff began to breathe again. A near crisis had been rerouted into a logistical item on a personal itinerary. Lila felt a peculiar dissonance, relief threaded with wariness. Invitations had always come with agendas. She was not blind to that. But she had also cultivated a fierce habit of making decisions from a ledger of facts, not rumor. "One more thing," she added. "If I accept, I will not be alone in your presence outside of work. A colleague or Mr. Garcia will be informed of all meetings and the schedule. We keep everything transparent." Karim didn't flinch. He seemed to respect that she refused to be isolated. "Then transparent it will be. Rachid, note that." The man at his side, Rashid, took a slow, businesslike nod. He was Karim's lawyer, and his presence was a punctuation mark assuring the world that whatever happened in that hotel tonight would be logged, notarized, and accounted for. Lila glanced at the staff, whose expressions were a new mix of pride and disbelief. She was, in that narrow second, visible, and she hated and loved the way it looked. Invisibility had been convenient sometimes. It had been a shield other times. But this visibility felt like a tool she could steer. She would not let it push her. "Very well," she said. "I'll be here tomorrow morning with details, and we will make it official." Karim smiled, a small, almost private thing. "I look forward to it, Lila Mendez." He offered a hand, the kind of formal gesture that could be read as an offering or a declaration. She took it, on her terms, in public, under the chandeliers that had trembled only an hour before. The lobby reassembled itself into the banal choreography of a hotel. Guests resumed their seats, luggage rolled, a bellboy resumed polishing a nearby brass, and somewhere someone laughed, a private laugh. One step at a time, Lila told herself as she turned back toward the employees' corridor. Her colleagues greeted her with a mixture of teasing warmth and guarded awe. Patricia clapped a hand to her mouth as if she had seen a miracle, then smacked Lila's shoulder in a manner that should be affectionate, but had the stigma of incredulity. "You're not going to the boss's suite, are you?" Patricia whispered later, when the cart was tucked into its closet. "Don't do anything. He could—" "I won't," Lila interrupted, quieter than the gossip needed. "I have conditions. I will sign a contract. It will be 2 weeks." Patricia's eyes widened. "Still, a billionaire. Think of the stories." "There are stories already," Lila said, folding sheets with methodical precision. "My story is the one I choose." That evening, after her shift, Lila walked through a night that smelled of frying oil and salt. The city was a collage of lights and smells. The kiosk where the old men played cards. The church whose bells bled into the street with the time of the hour. A bakery with warm baunji queijo spilling temptation into the midnight. She walked to a small cafe tucked on a side street, Dona Zelia's, the kind of place where everything had the taste of history. Dona Zelia knew everyone that passed her doorway, and she knew Lila's life in small, tender increments. When Lila pushed open the cafe's glass, the bell chimed and a kettle hissed like a welcome. "Lila, minha filha," Dona Zelia said, using the affectionate term. "My daughter," she translated for the air as she saw the young woman slip into the booth. She pulled a pot of strong, dark coffee scented with cardamom toward them. Cardamom, a spice that tasted like conversations where people confessed small things. "You look like you shook the very sky." Lila smiled into the warm mug. "Something like that," she said. "There was a man in the lobby. He asked me to dinner." Dona Zelia's eyes gleamed, not with gossip, but with something like a midwife's knowledge of possibilities. "And you said?" "I set terms," Lila said, surprising herself with how simple it sounded. The coffee was hot as certainty. Contract, 2 weeks, protective measures. He agreed. Dona Zelia shook her head. "And your studies, your masters? Do not let men come to you with gold and forget the books that made you." Lila laughed, a short, honest sound. "Helena will kill me if I leave my thesis, but the money will cover the last tuition. And Karim will pay for education?" Dona Zelia's question held no malice. She was neither jealous nor fearful of the wealthy. She was a woman who had been through many winters and measured every new thing for the endurance she might need. He said he would pay market rate as a consultant. He offered a legitimate contract. Lila stirred the coffee, watching the cardamom swirl like a promise. "Then go," Dona Zelia said, "but bring me a postcard from the place he lives. If you are to cross oceans, bring home a sea-scented memory." Lila thought of Oman, of the narrow alleys in Muscat where the air smelled of frankincense and oil, where embassy flags hung at half-mast for reasons she barely understood as a child. She thought of the slow, formal dinners where family names were rolled into conversation like coins. She thought of the small, private Spanish lessons her mother insisted upon for security, an asset no one could confiscate. She felt that old geography of memory tightening around her chest. She had not imagined returning to that cartography. She had not expected a man like Karim to offer a boat. At home, the apartment she shared with her mother was a map of displaced intents. Textbooks balanced against a teapot, an old family portrait with a diplomat's stern look, a shelf of well-worn passports. Helena Mendez spoke to Lila in a voice that had softened with age. "Whatever you choose, remember the frame," her mother said. "You always look at the frame." "I will sign a contract," Lila promised. "I will go because it is work. I will not be alone, and I will finish my degree." Helena dried her hands on a towel and nodded once, resolute in the way of people who had provided shelter for storms. "Then it is well done. But do not forget to eat. Do not let their riches make you thin." Lila kissed her mother's forehead and left the mug steaming on the counter. Late that night, she made a list in her head of items to bring for the trip. A copy of her transcripts, a folder for the contract, a small recorder for meetings, and the phrase she always returned to when she needed to center herself. "Ana mutamakina," the Arabic she had used as an affirmation in the embassy hallways as a child. "I am capable." She said it softly in the dark. The next morning unfolded like a tight, efficient machine. There were emails confirming times, a printed contract waiting in the back office, and a whispering cascade of colleagues offering practical advice. Take an extra pair of shoes. Make sure you get a daytime meeting, not evening. Don't forget to charge your phone. Lila moved through it all with the quiet steadiness of someone who had taught herself to carry a world inside a rucksack and make it work. Karim's assistant sent their itinerary. Karim himself appeared in the lobby again, the way a change of weather might appear, sudden and compelling. He greeted Lila with a nod that had the faintest glint of something like respect now woven through its surface. "All paperwork will be straightforward," he said, polite. "My people will meet you tonight to write the contract. Rachid will be present. Mr. Garcia will confirm your shift schedule. We are professionals." "We are professionals," Lila echoed. Words carried weight when they were repeated by mutual agreement. They signed the contract in a conference room heavy with mahogany and the smell of high-grade coffee. Rachid explained clauses with the patience of a man familiar with translating not only language, but also intent. The contract was careful. Scope of work, daily hours, remuneration, confidentiality, clauses protecting Lila's academic schedule, a termination clause if boundaries were crossed. It was, in its way, a promise verbally formalized into ink. Lila read every line. She did not sign on faith. She signed on terms. When the pen left the paper, the room sighed as if a small, contained storm had passed. Were there questions still unspoken? Of course. Were there risks? Always. But for now, the ledger balanced. Outside, Rio stretched in morning light, indifferent to the subtleties of human negotiation. Men unloaded crates onto trucks, a street vendor arranged fruit in a blaze of color. A bus coughed and scraped, and people pressed themselves into lives that required the stubbornness of small daily miracles. Lila stepped into the sun and felt for a moment like someone walking across the threshold of two countries in one stride. Karim watched her go with an attention that was not merely businesslike. For all his wealth, for all his global portfolios and boardroom certainties, there was something in Lila that refused to look like a commodity. She had boundaries. She kept them like tools. She had a past that made her language an asset, and private memory a polarity he did not yet understand. It intrigued him. That intrigue was the first small fault in the fortress of his anger. He had come to Rio to find footholds for investments, but this small human variable, this housekeeper who spoke his tongue like a key, felt like a new kind of leverage. For him, power had always been a form of translation. The right offer, the right phrase, the right gift could turn negotiation into allegiance. He had built empires on such moves. But Lila's terms did not immediately translate into the ledger he kept. That unsettled him, and the unsettlement had an odd quality to it, like curiosity mixed with a quiet, unfamiliar respect. For Lila, the 2 weeks ahead were not an easy epiphany. They were work. They were a test of whether words could be bridges and not traps. She planned each morning in her head. Go to the hotel, prepare the room she normally cared for, then sit in the back of the conference room where she would be an interpreter not only of language but of culture. She imagined simplifying Brazilian idioms for Arabic ears, softening directness into context, turning evasions into plans. She also imagined herself refusing any gesture that would blur boundaries she had set. The night before the trip, she stood on her building's tiny balcony and watched the city. Far off, where the lights met the sound of the ocean, the sky was an expanse that made plans seem both larger and more subject to small human frailties. She felt the weight of everything she would carry in her suitcase, books, documents, small family relics, and thought of how languages had been her inheritance and her weapon. Early the next morning, a car arrived to the hotel's back entrance. Karim had arranged discreet transport, tinted windows, a driver who spoke only necessary phrases. Lila got in with the folder of papers in her lap, the city's humidity folding around her. The ride to the airport was a brief chamber, where they were both still new to each other. Measured glances, the occasional mention of an agenda item, silence filled with small scans of each other's faces. At the terminal, they moved in a line of windows and announcements, a human flow that dissolved the grandeur of envelopes and signatures into the banal choreography of travel. Karim did not use his security to isolate her. He kept the gestures public and professional. That was part of the bargain they had struck, and perhaps it was why the arrangement felt less like a trap and more like a rehearsal for something neither of them understood. On the plane, while others slept or scrolled through devices, Lila opened a notebook and wrote down vocabulary she anticipated would be useful. Phrases for negotiating terms with rural landowners. A way to explain sustainable investment without losing the meaning in a direct-to-earnings translation. She did not write anything about romance. Dances had rules she had no intention of ignoring. Karim watched her with an interest that had softened into something like admiration. He had met many people in his life who could charm him briefly. Few could generate the steady competence she radiated. He found himself thinking of his own childhood in Abu Dhabi, of a different kind of containment, golden carpets and whispered expectations. He saw a mirror of sorts in Lila, someone who had learned to move between worlds without being wholly claimed by either. He had not yet learned the measure of patience required when trust was built slowly, nor had he, perhaps, understood how often wealth could substitute for time, and therefore, mistakenly, for intimacy. He was about to be schooled in that. They landed. The 2 weeks in Brazil began with meetings in glass-walled rooms and visits to a seaside solar farm where men in hard hats measured the horizon. Lila translated not only the words of farmers and engineers, but the rhythms, the soft Brazilian way of saying maybe instead of no, the rhythms of hospitality that meant commitment even when no contract existed. She reframed statements for Karim. When a local investor said, "We'll think about it," she translated it as, "We need to be convinced of long-term value." She learned quickly that cultural translation is not bilingualism, but a kind of diplomacy. One morning, after a meeting had reached an impasse over land rights, Lila stepped in with a story. She told of a community in Oman where water rights had been negotiated over tea and songs, where listening had been the currency that got the job done. She used the right phrases, the tone that conferred respect, and she did it with an ease that made men put down their pens and lean forward. "How did you learn to do this?" Karim asked her once, in the quiet of a late afternoon drive between meetings. "Mother taught me how to listen so people finish their sentences," Lila said, "and I studied how to turn that into agreements." He smiled, and for a moment there was no ledger on his face, only the warmth of someone who had encountered a new kind of skill. "You knew this would be your work." She hesitated. "I didn't expect this," she admitted, "but I know how to do it." That admission was not a confession of humility, but a declaration of capability. Karim noted it. He began to see that the advantage she offered was not the language alone, but the integrity with which she wielded it. At night, they would sometimes return to the hotel with the tired glow of the ocean still clinging to their clothes. The staff watched them with a new kind of attention. Rumors began to flit like small birds, about potential promotions, about the audacity of an employer to hire a housekeeper for a boardroom, about whether the job meant more than work. Lila kept her life in order in the way she had learned to, logistically perfect, emotionally cautious. There was a single evening when the line between professional and personal shimmered like heat above pavement. Karim, asking a favor, asked Lila to show him a part of the city she loved that no brochure would promote. "I want to see Brazil from you," he said. She looked at him. "I will show you, if there is transparency. If this is part of the work, we'll make it an official cultural immersion day. If it's for something else, we keep the professional boundaries." He listened, genuinely listening, and a decision brewed in his face. Make it official. And so they walked. Lila's experience was not just linguistic. It was an anthropology of kindness dressed as competence. She reframed impatience as negotiation. She returned a culture's evasions into long-term commitments. Her nights were still consumed by study when possible. At odd hours, she would sit with her thesis drafts and the contracts they'd signed, comparing clauses and sentences as if they were siblings from different fathers. Her identity as a scholar and her role as a cleaner-turned-consultant did not resolve into a comfortable narrative. They braided into a more complicated, truer thing. Rumors from colleagues reached her like summer storms. Is he? Will he? But Lila answered with facts and not with drama. The 2-week consultancy was a professional turn. The rest, if it emerged, would be negotiated, like all things that mattered. And yet, there were nights she would stand by the window of her hotel room and watch the Arabian lights flicker in the distance, as if she could imagine a place where both her worlds met. Karim, too, would look at the city with a new promptment to tenderness. He had, in an unaccustomed way, begun to see the world as a place where power could be shared rather than wielded. At the end of the first 2 weeks, as meetings accumulated and contracts drafted, it became clear a larger question would be asked. Karim called Lila into his suite one evening, not as a guest, but as someone accustomed now to professional closeness. He closed the door and gestured toward the glass that showed the city spread like possibility. "Lila," he said, and in his voice there was a softness she was learning not to mistake for a promise. "You have been indispensable. Your presence changed the tenor of conversations. Your translation, a cultural translation, was the key. I am considering something more long-term." She looked at him, measured, as she always did. "What do you mean by more long-term?" "I mean a role." His hands were the hands of a man used to issuing titles. "Director of Cultural Liaison for our Brazil office." It would mean relocation, partnership, responsibility. It would mean leadership. The offer was substantial, each word a weight that could anchor or drown. Lila felt for a moment the echo of the shattered glass in the lobby, a moment of rupture that began everything. The offer was tempting. It was also enormous. It would require her to rearrange not just her schedule, but the geography of her life. "I need time," she said finally. "It is a big move. My thesis, my commitments, my mother, these are not small things." "I know," Karim said. "I don't expect an answer tonight. But I want to be frank. My interest is sincere. I want you in a position where you can lead, with full authority, not as an assistant or translator. I will put it on paper. My lawyer will draft an offer. But I need to know if it's something you might consider." Lila's heart measured out a cautious rhythm. The stakes had multiplied from 2 weeks of paid consultancy to the architecture of a life. She felt the math of responsibility, shining and slow. "I will consider it," she said, "but on conditions: equal authority, clear responsibilities, guaranteed support for my studies if I need to finish them, and, one more time, we keep every personal boundary transparent. If there's anything beyond professional, we negotiate it openly. No assumptions." "Agreed," Karim said. He reached for the pen on his desk and scribbled something absent-mindedly. "We will make it fair." They both rose. Their handshake was a kind of draft, one of many that would later be inked, renegotiated, and lived. Outside the suite, the city did not pause for human decisions. The world kept its indifferent pace, but in their small orbit, a different current began to move. Lila left the suite with a file folder in hand and a resolve that felt like a new garment, heavier than before, but fitting. A new question would be posed soon. Could she build a life that included the career he offered and the person she wanted to remain? Could someone with money and power learn to love restraint and respect as true currencies? As she walked down the hall, she passed by the lobby where the chandelier still cast long shadows on the floor. The memory of the glass breaking returned not as a trauma, but as a hinge, the loud crack that had opened the door to what came after. She touched the small folder to her chest, a reminder that every agreement would be a negotiation of self. The night smelled of rain and opportunity. The city hummed. Lila had accepted only the terms of a future conversation. The saga was just beginning. Lila walked the corridor with the small folder held like an armor against the unknown. The hall smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the last traces of perfume from departing guests. Doors slid open and shut as if the hotel itself were breathing, an organism of polished surfaces and practiced smiles. She felt the file's weight against her ribs, a set of clauses, a copy of her transcripts, the paper that could tilt a life, and thought of the tiny balcony at home where the city had seemed to expand and shrink at once. She thought of Humberto the bellboy, whistle-talking about impossible promotions, of Patricia's half-jokes, of her mother's hands, precise with the memory of foreign foods and long lectures on the importance of frames. Word of the engagement had moved faster than she had expected. In the staff room, the morning after the contract signing, colleagues formed a small ring around her like a curious tide. Some faces held the sly sparkle of gossip. Others had the quiet pride of people who recognize when one of their own has been given a chance. "You're really doing it?" Patricia asked, as if repeating the question could make it more plausible. Her tone was threaded with mischief and worry in equal parts. "I am doing it," Lila said. Her hands folded and smoothed a towel she was not yet ready to use. 2 weeks, consultancy. Then, maybe more, but I'm careful. Patricia's eyebrows climbed. "Careful? Lila, you signed with a billionaire." Lila smiled, not indulgent, not defensive. "I signed with a contract." Contracts had been her scaffolding for years. The scholarship rules, the terms of a shared apartment, the bureaucratic minutes of a diplomat's household. A paper with clauses could be a ladder if you climbed it intentionally. She had chosen every clause like a step. Termination for boundary breaches, guaranteed payment, hours protected for study, a clause for a chaperone at all after-hours meetings. The words on the paper were not a fairy godmother. They were tools. Their work in Brazil gathered momentum. The pilot project with the small solar cooperative moved from slide deck optimism to muddy test site reality. Engineers crawled over the plots with hard hats, and community elders circled like constellations with livelihoods at the center. The cooperative's leader, Senor Almeida, had the slow, cautious honesty of a man who had lost more than a few investments to slick promises. He was polite but sharp. When he said, "Vamos ver," we'll see, he meant it as a beginning, not an end. At a negotiation under a tin-roofed community hall, the language of business transformed into something human. Coffee steaming from metal urns, men with tobacco-stained fingers sitting on plastic chairs, a ceiling fan turning time into soft noise. Karim arrived in a suit that looked faintly absurd in the heat. He had insisted on coming, insisting on seeing the ground truth that would either seal his confidence or force him to reconsider the numbers. The first minutes of that meeting were tense. Karim's team, used to polished presentations and ROI tables, misread the local reticence for refusal. They pushed for rapid commitments. Almeida folded his hands and let silence do its slow work. Lila watched the exchange like someone reading a language both speakers thought they knew. She could see Karim's impatience like a crease. She could sense the elder's need to be seen as steward, not a ledger entry. She stepped forward and translated not only words, but posture. "He said he wants to ensure the community will maintain ownership," she told Karim in Arabic, the words soft between them. "Huwa yurid an yata'akkad an al-mujtama'a sayastafid biintidabat." She then told the farmers the Emirati line in Portuguese. "He says he wants a long-term partnership, not a quick buyout." Everyone heard the same message in a different register, and the tension shifted from a wall to a bridge. "You don't rush these things," Almeida said when she turned the language into the right tone. You build them. Lila knew how to build without promising miracles. A phased payment tied to training local technicians, a clause preserving communal land rights, a transparency requirement with local committees. She suggested a pilot with clear metrics. 3-year pilot, she said aloud, translating each term into Arabic and Portuguese, and the numbers, simple, visible, accountable, began to make sense. Karim watched the process with a new kind of concentration, the kind that comes when a problem yields to the right sequence of gestures. 3 years, he repeated. Metrics, community training, no expropriation. Exactly, Lila said. Her voice had that rare blend of warmth and precision that disarmed assumptions. It is one thing to speak a language, it is another to use it as a tool of protection. Karim's team, previously impatient, started to annotate, their skeptical faces opening into something like respect. Successes piled in the way practical things do. Signed memos with post-it notes smudged by coffee, payments released into escrow, a training session where young technicians learned to check inverters and tighten bolts. Each concrete outcome was a small, stacking triumph that shielded the relationship from being reduced to rumor. Rumors still came. At breakfast in the hotel, a journalist called to ask, off the record, about the housekeeper turned consultant. A social media account photoshopped a candid of Lila at a meeting into a story about favors. Patricia took on the role of a mercurial sister, protective, furious at the cheapness of gossip. "People will say anything," she muttered. "They will say you did it for a smile." "Then let them say whatever keeps them busy," Lila replied. She was weary of rumor, but not fragile to it. Rumor floated, paper held. She used both hands on the papers in front of her, fortifying the facts. Not everyone was convinced. Carlos Menezes, an executive at Solaris Hotels whose name vibrated in boardroom circles, had been invited to a roundtable and arrived with a skeptical brow. He had seen narratives like this. Flattering stories of improbable talent elevated by the glare of business headlines. Men who liked being impressed by stories more than by results. "Miss Mendez," he said, in a quiet voice that hid the blade of evaluation, "how will you scale this? One person at meetings is not a structural solution." She answered him directly, with the calm of someone used to direct questions. "Scale comes through training, Mr. Menezes. I am not proposing that I be the bridge forever. I propose a model, training local liaisons, a cultural onboarding protocol, and an advisory manual so our approach becomes replicable." She described a template, meeting scripts, culturally appropriate rituals for respect, meeting elders with gifts of food rather than envelopes, translation protocols that didn't lose tone. Carlos's face did not change at once, but his notes thickened, a sign a person is listening. It was in the penumbra of those meetings that their private geography changed. Karim's looks sharpened, not always at her, but at the way she arranged a meeting, at the way she refused to be isolated in conversation. He was learning restraint. He was learning that patience was part of power when wielded well. He asked fewer leading questions about her past, and instead asked practical ones about her plans for staff training, her ideas for community reinvestment, her concerns about governance. At night, when the city had the long hush between its commerce and its sleep, Layla and Karim occasionally spoke in guarded terms that felt not like flirtation, but like two people unpacking tools. Once, Karim asked about her mother. "Helena," Layla said, and then in Arabic, because certain names carry warmth across languages, "Ismi Ummi Helena. My mother's name is Helena. She always taught me to name the frame before stepping through it." She told him about Helena's modest apartment in the outskirts, the books, and the worn maps. Karim listened to a story that did not need embellishment. He respected it. "Your mother sounds wise," he said. "She sounds like someone who would make sure you do not take flights you will regret." "She is like that," Layla smiled. "She will call me 1,000 times." When rumors hardened into a test, it was Mr. Garcia who gave the first public defense. A guest complained in a social column that the hotel's image was compromised by the association with the investor. Garcia, who had been both manager and protector, wrote a formal note to staff. The hotel endorsed professional consultancies, it supported its employees' growth, it recognized the dignity of every role. When Patricia sent Layla the forwarded note, it felt like armor. Still, there were nights when Layla lay awake, the city's distant waves beating the same slow rhythm as her pulse, wondering about the calculus of meaning in a new life. The offer Karim was drafting, the director title, the partnership possibility, carried an architecture she had to inspect carefully. She had been clear: equal authority, a seat at the table with voting rights, protection for her academic schedule, and a community mandate built into her remit. She would not accept a titular leadership that replaced the substance. She had a list of non-negotiables. Rashid, Karim's lawyer, presented a draft that balanced legal language with the bluntness of pragmatism. It proposed an initial 2-year term as Director of Cultural Liaison with the option for extension, a mandate to create a Brazil advisory board with half local members, a clause allocating a portion of profits to community reinvestment, a continuing education provision that guaranteed leave for studies. There was equity on the table, but not the full share Karim had first alluded to when speaking emotionally in the suite. Rashid was cautious of optics. Karim had been generous in speech, but the lawyers kept dollars as measured things. Layla read every line. She called Helena that night, the phone across the ocean like a thin rope. "Remember your frame," Helena said in Portuguese. "Lembre-se do quadro." Remember the frame. Look at the responsibilities. Who will you be responsible for? Will there be people under you who need training? Will you have legal support? Do not sign a name if you cannot live in it. Lila answered each of her mother's questions with details. She told her about the advisory board composition, the training budgets, the metrics for community reinvestment. Helena's voice softened with approval. "If this is what you want," Helena said finally, "then take it. But do not let the title be the ruler of your life. Let the work be." The negotiations stretched like elastic. Karim's initial offer increased in certain ways: budget for programs, a small equity stake conditioned on performance, a relocation package that would cover Helena should she need to visit. But Lila insisted on a clause she had crafted with an eye for protection, a binding policy against implied personal expectations, a clause that would trigger immediate termination of the professional agreement if personal boundaries were breached and documented. It read like legal armor. Any non-consensual personal advances by the employer toward the consultant, documented by 2 witnesses or formal communication, shall constitute a breach and permit immediate termination with full settlement. When she suggested it, Karim paused. He was not used to contracts naming his possible missteps. He listened without offense. That was perhaps the most revealing thing about this man. He could be proud and still allow a mirror to be placed in front of him. He signed, without drama, because he could see how the clause also protected him from rumor and from any sticky entanglement that could threaten the business. "Fair," he said simply, "no gray areas." "Good," Lila said. Her voice was even. Contracts were not declarations of trust. They were scaffolds that made trust legible. They formalized the arrangement in the glass conference room where oak met sunlight. Marcos Vasconcelos, the hotel owner, who had been traveling when the whole thing began, appeared for the signatures, smiling with the bemusement of someone watching a quiet revolution. Carlos signed with the thoroughness of someone suddenly invested. Rachid oversaw the witness signatures and placed a heavy stamp on the bright-lined pages. For Lila, it felt both momentous and ordinary. Pens, initials, witnesses, a final notary. After the signatures, a small celebration took place at Donazelia's cafe. She had prepared a cake with a folklore pattern of icing and a small postcard that smelled faintly of the sea when Lila opened it. "See," Donazelia said, tugging at Lila's sleeve. "You get a postcard now and then. Keep your feet on the ground and always bring back a story." Lila laughed, and Karim bought coffee. Not a token, but an intention. He listened as Lila described plans for training, for ensuring the cooperatives had governance members with legal training, for co-investing with local microfinance groups so projects did not rely on a single large check. He was impressed by the detail and the moral architecture. Their relationship matured by degrees that belonged to conversations rather than gestures. They dined sometimes in public, sometimes with staff present. They avoided private rooms that could be misread. They discussed family traditions, and he taught her about Emirati hospitality rituals, the importance of offering dates before coffee as a sign of respect, the formal cadence of greeting elders. She showed him how to greet a samba circle, how to call a taxi the way locals did, how to respect a neighborhood priest without confusing religion and culture. Each exchange was an act of translation and gift. Consent became explicit, not assumed. Once, when Karim reached automatically to touch her hand at the end of a long day, an old habit of comfort, Lila paused. "That's a nice gesture," she said softly. "But if we make those gestures often, let's speak about them. It's not just the touch, it's the meaning behind it." He looked at her, the way bankers look at changing markets, with a willingness to recalibrate. "Thank you for telling me that," he said. "I want to understand your boundaries. Tell me when I cross them." "Tell me when you cross them too," she replied. They both laughed at the awkward equality of it. It was not romance's fever, but its choreography, two people learning steps together. As the months advanced, the office took form. Lila assembled a team, some local hires, some trained in cross-cultural interviews, and a liaison officer who understood the particularities of rural contracts. She created a manual, phrases to avoid that might sound patronizing in Portuguese and be disastrous in Arabic, a checklist for community meetings that included a guarantee of translation and coffee, a transparency protocol for funds that involved local bank accounts and joint signatory rules. Her work was meticulous, not glamorous, and that steadiness, more than any grand speech, earned her trust. Success built in small increments that added up. A school roof paid for out of profits, a water well that remained community managed because the contract required oversight, a local woman trained as an electrician who later taught others. When the cooperative inaugurated its first solar microgrid with a ribbon cutting that involved paper streamers and local music, Karim stood in the back, watching a woman who had once been invisible to most hotel guests cut a ribbon that would bring light to dozens of homes. He walked up to her afterward. "You built this," he said simply. "We did," she corrected. "It was theirs. I helped frame it." His admiration was not theatrical. It had the small, clean tone of a man who observed and adjusted. "Your name should be on the plaque," he felt compelled to say. "No," she said. "Thank you, but let's put the community's name. That's the point." He smiled at that stubbornness, at the insistence that her work would not become a vehicle for her own fame, but a lever for collective change. Their private life evolved as steadily as the work. There were dinners where intimacy grew in the softest ways, conversations that lasted past midnight, shared playlists where she introduced him to a favorite Brazilian singer and he introduced her to a poet who had been in his family's library. They alternated who showed the other a tradition. She taught him a Portuguese lullaby. He taught her to negotiate the formalities of an Emirati dinner table with grace. There were touches, yes, but always asked for, always consented to. When the question of deeper commitment surfaced, both were deliberate. It came up not in a single cinematic proposal, but in small canvases of conversation. Talk over coffee about future offices, a shared plan to host a joint cultural festival in Rio, a suggestion from Rachid that they should draft a separation of roles clause should their personal relationship change the professional dynamic. They were not naive. They wanted to scaffold any personal development with frameworks that protected both the business and the people who could be harmed if power blurred. The offer for partnership formalized into a longer-term contract, a 3-year renewable term as director with an option for equity vesting over 5 years, a board seat, and a commitment to relocate the primary office to a community hub in Rio rather than a gated business center. There were hospitalities earmarked for community festivals, small budgets that shifted the narrative from extraction to reinvestment. Lila's acceptance was not dramatic. She sat across from Karim and Rachid with her pen poised. "I will accept," she said, "with the following conditions. My studies will be allowed a 2-year completion window with leave. The advisory board must be populated by at least 3 local community-elected members, and the equity vests only if agreed metrics are met in transparency and community outcomes." "Done," Karim said. He signed without flourish. He had learned to find clarity and move there. They celebrated publicly at a launch event, surrounded by the staff who had watched the original glass shard fall months before. Mr. Garcia stood near the doorway like a man who had been given a small victory. Patricia pressed a hand to Lila's arm and whispered, "You did not forget us." "I didn't," Lila said, "and you won't let me." The months that followed were a montage of work, schooling, and slow, affectionate partnership. She flew occasionally to Abu Dhabi and Dubai to coordinate with Karim's headquarters, and he came to Rio for strategic meetings where she insisted the agenda included community visits. They built an internship program that put young Brazilians into secondments at the Brazil office, and Karim began to fund scholarships in Lila's name, small, practical things that smoothed pathways. Helena visited for a season. She arrived with a suitcase of comfort foods and a watchful skepticism that melted into pride as she watched her daughter chair a board meeting on governance, politely reframing a CEO's remark about efficiency into a question about social impact. "You are strong in the right way," Helena told her in private, in Portuguese. "You make the world accountable." Dona Zelia received the promised postcard from Dubai one spring. It had a stamp and a small narrative line. "The sea smells different here, but we will visit soon." She pinned it to the cafe wall like a blessing. There were tense days. Once, a contract with a landowner required careful arbitration after an old title resurfaced. A rumor from a local magazine suggested favoritism. The story threatened to inflame local mistrust. Lila called a public meeting, transparent and simple, and opened the books, line by line, expense by expense. She invited community elders to speak and allowed journalists to sit in the circle and ask questions. The clarity of the ledger, coupled with open accountability, quelled suspicion more effectively than any private defense. In the small hours between flights and board reports, the personal question rose again. It was not a drama. It was a conversation at a hotel balcony in Dubai, looking out over a skyline that looked as if it were stitched from lights. "Lila," Karim said softly, "we have built something real. Not perfect, not without problems, but real." She looked at him. The city's lights reflected in his eyes like currency. "Real is a work," she replied, "and work needs agreements." "Agreements," he echoed, smiling. He picked up a paper napkin and doodled a small heart, childlike, almost embarrassed by its simplicity. "Would you consider being more than this? Not because of the title, but because of what we've shared?" She turned the napkin over like it was a small object to be measured. "I would," she said, "if we first sign a few more agreements." She laughed, and the laughter was a bridge. "We will define how we handle public appearances, how we keep professional decisions independent, how we manage rumors. We will set rules for traveling together for work and separate travel for family. And most importantly, we will make any step forward together, no surprises." "It sounds very legal," he said, amused. "It's because we've learned to protect what matters," she said. He reached for her then, asking, not assuming. She gave it, calm and consenting. That kiss, if it can be called that, was a punctuation in the ledger of their lives, not an erasure of discipline. Time blurred its edges into routine and ritual. The Brazil office matured into a space that reflected their shared priorities. A training center with solar panels installed by the cooperative, a boardroom with local art, a policy library with translations in Portuguese and Arabic. Lila continued her thesis, submitting a final chapter on cultural mediation and investment models that protect community agency. She earned her degree in a modest ceremony, her mother in the front row with a small bouquet. When Helena hugged her afterward, she whispered the phrase Lila had used to steady herself for years. Ana mutamakina, I am capable. The personal life between Lila and Karim blossomed, not as an altar to wealth, but as a partnership built on mutual respect. They traveled to meet family. To Abu Dhabi, where he introduced her to his aunt and uncle who asked sharp and kind questions about governance. To Helena's small apartment, where Karim learned how to roll pain de quijo with clumsy, sincere fingers. They discussed traditions they would honor if marriage ever came, her insistence on her mother's presence, his insistence that family rituals were shared in language and action, not subsumed. When they finally stood on a terrace in Dubai months later, the skyline spread behind them like a new map. The wind had the faint tang of sea and desert that did not belong to any single place. Karim did not kneel, he was not theatrical. Instead, he handed her a small book of planning notes. Inside, on a page where he had written in both Arabic and Portuguese, was a sketch of a ceremony. Elements of both cultures, water, music, food, a small pledge about shared responsibilities. I want to know how you'll have your wedding, he said, not to tell you how to do it, to learn how to make it yours. She read the brief notes and then looked up. The thoughtfulness was a promise of process, not of conclusions. Then we will plan together, she said. We will plan with our families. We will honor both sides. He smiled like a man who had learned that power is sometimes what you surrender to make something shared flourish. Inshallah, he said, if God wills it, a natural phrase to him, and he added the translation for the small crowd of family members who had gathered, those who did not speak Arabic. If God wills it. She laughed with relief and affection, the way someone laughs when they find a safe harbor that also invites motion. They did not speak of perfection, they spoke of intentions, of respect, of a shared life that would continue to require negotiation. The world beyond them hummed, deal pipelines, board meetings, communities in Brazil still waiting for infrastructure. Their love was not a cure for complexity. It was a partnership that could carry complexity. Months later, the plaque at the cooperative read not a single name, but many, for the community and for those who stood with them. At the same time, a small office in Dubai displayed a framed photograph of a ribbon cutting in Brazil. Lila's name was on a schedule of guest lecturers, and she still folded hotel towels when she visited her old colleagues, hands practiced in the same exactness. On a quiet morning, in the same lobby where glass had once shattered to announce a crisis, a new glass awning caught the sunrise and sent a stripe of light across the marble. Guests moved through the lobby as if nothing had been unusual. Staff performed the choreography of service with pride. Lila walked through it now with a key card and a new badge, Director of Cultural Liaison. People looked at her differently, the look of recognition that arrives after someone has shown they belong in more than one place. She paused beneath the chandelier that had trembled months before, and watched the light fracture across the polished floor. Not a shard, not a wound this time, but a pattern of small, ordinary reflections. She touched the folder at her hip, a ritual that reminded her of the ledger of choices that had led here. Contracts read, clauses insisted on, boundaries set and respected, a career built slowly and deliberately. Karim joined her at the lobby bar, carrying 2 coffees. He stood beside her and watched the morning bustle. "You remember that day?" he asked, nodding at the place where the goblet had fallen. "Yes," she said. "It could have ended badly," he said, "for both of us." "It could have," she agreed. "But it didn't," he said, "because you made sure it wouldn't, because you insisted on clarity." She smiled. "And you listened." He reached for her hand, not in a contract this time, but in a small personal agreement that neither of them needed printed. "So, what's next?" he asked. "More work," she said, laughing. "More training, more coffee, more postcards for Donna Zalia." "And," he pressed, amused. "And life," she said. 2 cultures, 2 offices, 1 partnership." He squeezed her hand. "1 partnership," he repeated. They walked out into the sunlight together, a man who had once stormed into a lobby and a woman who had answered in a language that surprised him. The power between them had transformed from something sharp and dangerous into something steady and shared. It had not disappeared, It had been negotiated. At the end of the day, Lila stood on the balcony of the new office, looking out at a skyline that included both the jagged lines of Rio's hills and, in her mind, the neat glass towers of Dubai. She took out the small postcard she had received long ago and pressed it into her palm. The world had not offered a miracle. It had offered possibilities that required work. She felt the weight of that and the lightness that comes when work aligns with values. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and tell us in the comments which cross-cultural moment moved you most: the lobby revelation, the Samba night, or the solar cooperative ribbon cutting. Your favorite might be the very thing someone else needed to hear.